Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of our Adaptation Co-Creation series, the space where innovation and climate resilience meet. In today's session, which is webinar 8 of this series, we're going to be talking about designing the utilities of the future, how water utilities are keeping up with climate change. Water utilities and actors across the water sector are recognizing that climate change poses a risk to their business and service delivery. And today we're going to be hearing from experts with WUCA, the Water Utility Climate Alliance, with WSP, with Aspen Global Change Institute, and with the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, AGWA, to learn how those risks are being assessed and how water utilities are staying ahead of the risk to deliver services today and continue to into the future. Before we get too far, we'll do a quick tech check here. We are in Zoom webinar format, so your microphones are off and cameras will be off except for our presenters. We welcome you to use the chat box or the Q&A function to go ahead and post up questions that may be coming up. And it sounds like, oh, I see someone using the chat right now. If you have questions that are coming up or any concerns about tech, please feel free to reach out to Brianna Nels. She is ASAP's program manager and available on today's call to help with all of your tech questions. Also, feel free to use the chat to connect with one another. If you have questions that might be for somebody else who you see in the room, don't be shy. Go ahead and use that chat both to communicate with our presenters, but use this as a networking space as well. Before we dive into today's session, I want to just tell you a little bit about ASAP and the work that we do. The American Society of Adaptation Professionals connects and supports climate change adaptation and resilience professionals to advance innovation and excellence in the field of practice. At ASAP, we believe that climate change is a real and a serious danger, and that adaptation and resilience build stronger, more prepared communities, ecosystems, and that equity and environmental justice must be centered in all of the work that adaptation professionals do. Our members are working across all segments and industries to ensure that the ecosystems, economies across North America are prepared for the impacts of climate change. Some of the ways that we do this are through our 4 program areas: our ASAP Connects program, Adaptation Careers, Adaptation Voices, and our ASAP Serves program. We look at these programs as ways that members can meet new people and explore new ideas. In our careers program, we help adaptation professionals to excel in their current job and to identify new opportunities. Our Adaptation Voices program lifts up the work and the stories of climate adaptation on the ground, where we work to feature those people who are at the fence line, the forefront, or the front line of climate impacts and how their work is leading adaptation and resilience practices. And our Adaptation Serves program is our capacity building program, wherein we see adaptation professionals giving back to one another, and we help to support them as they grow as leaders in their communities and in our shared community. Our ASAP members come from all across North America, with members primarily from the US, but also throughout Canada and the Caribbean. And our members come from all sectors, from academia, nonprofit, for-profit, and government. ASAP is a place where people meet to learn how to enhance and strengthen their practices with others who may not be like them, but are facing similar challenges and looking for similar capacity building opportunities. In addition to the individual members who make up ASAP, we also have a robust community of organizational members. Our organizational members equal over 100,000 individual staff members at this point, and range from our foundations to public agencies, to private companies, to cities and counties. And all of our work is made possible from membership dues, including the dues from those individuals and organizations, And organizations, especially when they join ASAP, extend the benefits of membership to their staff, to their clients, and they ensure that they have a hand in both building the adaptation field and benefiting from the resources and knowledge that come from ASAP membership. In addition to the organizations that we have logos for, we're excited to announce in the last week, we've had Parametrics join us, as well as the Climate Resilience Fund join us as organizational members. So if you're interested in learning more about organizational membership, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. So we're gathered here today to join in the next session of our adaptation co-creation series. And we're grateful for the year-long sponsorship of this series by Risk Solutions. This is the Resilience Infrastructure for Sustainable Communities cluster, which is a cluster of public and private sector professionals focused on climate resiliency via delivery and finance of market-based green stormwater infrastructure across the Great Lakes region, and also through the sponsorship of WSP. WSP's leadership in the climate adaptation and resilience and sustainability fields is well known and can be seen in its climate response, sustainability, and resilience business line. They were named the most sustainable company in the engineering industry in 2019 and 2020 by the World Finance magazine. And in 2019, they became a signatory of the UNGC and became the first professional services firm to sign sustainability-linked credit terms in the Americas and continue their internal efforts to fully align with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So in coming to the co-creation series, I know many of you have joined us for past sessions, but if this is the first time that you're in a co-creation series, what you can expect is that you're going to hear about work that is innovative and effective in driving forward adaptation practice. You're going to hear from diverse project teams, teams which reach across industries and sectors, and you're going to hear about how justice and equity are woven throughout this interdisciplinary work and in the work to drive adaptation forward. If you've come to past webinars, you may recall hearing conversations on reducing flooding through updated design codes and standards. In this session, which was our kickoff session, we heard about work in Virginia Beach and Broward County and how municipalities are working together to update their sea level rise and storm design standards, and how through working with private companies, they've been able to transfer lessons both between communities and across levels of government. We've heard about innovative finance mechanisms, talking with Quantified Ventures, with Joyce Coffey of Climate Resilience Consulting, and learning about how the Rhode Island Green Infrastructure Bank is stepping in as a state-level entity to ensure that local governments have the money and the funds that they need to implement adaptation practice. We've heard about the TCFD journey from the corporate perspective, learning from Microsoft, Northern Trust, and American Family Insurance about how they have been pursuing TCFD and the way that conversations around climate risk and responding to that risk in a way that centers justice and community is creating new opportunities for collaboration between corporate and public entities. We've talked about visualizing change, the importance of really giving communities the tools to see the differences that are coming in their community. And we've talked then about how we build resilience from structures to communities. And we've met with folks from USGBC and others who are creating standards and standards of care that can guide all of our work. And so in today's session, I'm so glad for us to be turning toward the water sector. We're going to be talking about the journey of water utilities in the US addressing climate change and how utilities and other water industries are applying different frameworks to assess their risk, conduct resilience assessments, and plan for, implement, and monitor adaptation strategies. In addition to having just a terrific topic and to have terrific organizations represented, I'm totally thrilled to have a panel of all women who are joining us today. These women who we'll be hearing from include Kavita Hine, a climate a climate resiliency planning manager at Portland Water Bureau and the chair of the Water Utility Climate Alliance. We're going to be hearing from Julie Vano, who's a research director at Aspen Global Change Institute. We're going to be hearing from Emily Wasley, who's a practice leader in WSP's Sustainability, Energy, and Climate Change team and president of the ASAP Board of Directors, and from Kari Davis, who's the technical director at the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. So we're going to have first Kavita and Julie set the stage for us by talking about the journey that water utilities have been on, recognizing and integrating climate change into their business and service delivery model. But first, let me tell you a little bit about the background of both of these terrific experts. First, Kavita leads several climate resilience and adaptive long-term water planning efforts in collaboration with climate scientists, federal and local agencies, and water sector peers. She has a master's degree she has a master's of environmental science and management from the University of California, Santa Barbara, in the London School of Economics and Political Science. Julie Vano is the research director at AGCI, and her research interests include hydrology, water resource management, science policy, climate change impacts, and system dynamics. And her current work aims to better connect climate science and the applications communities use and use these connections to develop innovative ways to address climate impacts on water resources. So Julie and Kavita, thanks so much for joining us and send us on our journey.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. And so I'm Julie, and as Beth just mentioned, I'm a hydrologist by training, and I've worked for over a decade now on studying climate change impacts. So I live in a world of climate and hydrology models, and a world trying to understand really how increases in temperature and precipitation are going to impact our rivers and streams, and subsequently the way that we manage our water systems. So I've been really fortunate to connect with water utilities early in my academic career. I helped design one of WUCA's projects on piloting model applications with the Portland Water Bureau when doing my degree at the University of Washington. And then I went on to do research that was really focused on helping water managers navigate the vast amount of climate information that's out there and its considerable uncertainties. So I was working on my project that was called the Do's and Don'ts of Using Climate Information in Water Planning and Management, which was focusing on providing guidance for setting up studies to use climate information when Laurna Kaatz at Denver Water first approached me about helping with WUCA's Leading Practices project. So at the start, I sheepishly admit, I envisioned it really as an opportunity to think more deeply about understanding the climate information and its appropriate use. But instead, I think this work has really broadened my thinking about the larger field of adaptation, and which climate information is certainly an important part of, but it's so much bigger than that. And so adaptation really as a tool for decision-making that can really help us to navigate through and go beyond just focusing on the climate uncertainties that we're all facing. So with that, I want to pass it along to Kavita to talk a little bit more about the WUCA perspective.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks, Beth, for that great introduction. Hi, everyone. My name's Kavita Hine, as Beth mentioned, and I'm the Climate Resiliency Planning Manager at the Portland Water Bureau in Portland, Oregon, and I'm also the chair of the Water Utility Climate Alliance, or WUCA, as we're known. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to try and frame the journey of our water utilities' response to climate change and what brings us here today to speak to you all. So WUCA is a coalition of 12 large water utilities that nationally serve 50 million Americans their drinking water. We came together over a decade ago with a mission to collaboratively advance water utility climate change adaptation in response to this challenge of a hotter and more uncertain future. WUCA's longer-term vision is climate resilient water utilities that support thriving communities. We strive to really advance water utility climate adaptation so that our communities can thrive in a changing world. And our work on adaptation is catalyzed by the fact that, as you'll hopefully hear today, water utilities really are on the front lines of climate change. We know firsthand that climate change is here and now, and climate change is water change. And we're already observing impacts of climate change to our water systems and the communities we serve. Climate change is another risk that our water utilities have to deal with, and it exacerbates existing challenges and presents new ones to our sector. So the efforts we're presenting to you today in particular come from our recognition that climate change impacts all of our organizational functions. We know, of course, climate change affects our water supplies, but it also presents new risks and liabilities to our financial assets. So as many of you probably know, the insurance, financial, and bond rating entities are all over this issue, and we need to be prepared to respond and reduce our risks. We also know there's a human health cost and impact to climate change that affects our workforce, especially our outdoor workers. So in response, the Water Utility Climate Alliance's new strategic plan integrates equity into our coalition's objectives and work. One of our main goals as an alliance is to mainstream climate adaptation. So this concept of mainstreaming, if you aren't familiar with it, basically means proactively streamlining and embedding climate information and adaptation into practices, plans, and decisions in our agencies. And we want to help our adaptation partners do this as well. So we're also focused on building adaptive capacity so our organizations are nimble and flexible in the face of accelerating climate risks. We're really happy to be here today speaking to members of ASAP to share our lessons learned on mainstreaming and also to learn from many of you. Co-production and co-creation and working with research partners and experts like Julie Vano and Emily Wasley from WSP, who you'll hear from today, and also adaptation peers like yourselves is really at the heart of the work that we're doing in our alliance and in the water sector. So thank you for being here. We're excited to share two projects with you today that I think Beth will talk about more in a moment: business function mapping and leading practices. And we really believe these projects provide concrete examples and methods for integrating climate change more comprehensively into the work we all do, not just in the water sector, but transforming into lessons learned that can apply across the adaptation community. So we hope you find this inspiring and useful. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julie and Kavita, for that introduction. So the way that we're going to proceed into the presentations that we have this hour are that we're going to hear three presentations on frameworks available for thinking about climate change in the water industry. And then we're going to be going deeper into that latest report from WUCA, which is going to talk to us about leading practices in climate adaptation. And from there, we're going to be thinking about how we step from the water sector into taking these resources into all of our work, wherever you're doing your adaptation practice. And so for our next section, as we move into this look at frameworks, I'm so happy to be introducing Emily Wasley. Emily leads the corporate risk and resilience practice for WSP USA. She partners with publicly traded and privately held companies to identify, assess, manage, and report the various risks and opportunities associated with the physical climate risks of climate change and the transition to a low carbon economy consistent with the guidance provided in TCFD. She also serves as the West Coast Future Ready Advisor for WSP, and she's the president of the American Society of Adaptation Professionals Board of Directors. Emily, thank you so much for being here, and I'll hand it to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Beth, and thank you so much for inviting me. And Kavita and Julie, thank you so much for that introduction of kind of why we're here and why there's an importance, significant importance for climate change for water utilities, but how the variety of different projects that WUCA invests in can really help to expand beyond water utilities and into those host communities and the organizations that live and work in those regions where water utilities are so dependent upon. So a little bit of background on a connection that I wanted to make before we dive into this. So Beth mentioned the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. Kavita mentioned bondholders and investors are really looking into how organizations are understanding, assessing, and disclosing their climate-related risks, but also their climate-related opportunities. So what are the opportunities associated with creating a more sustainable or resilient future? So the project that I'm going to speak to is has been WUCA-led for over 3 years, and it's broken out into 2 phases. The first phase was kicked off in 2018 with 7 different water utilities funded by the Water Utility Climate Alliance and the Water Research Foundation, and really led into this new framework that's been updated and was released in 2020. So wanted to give a little bit of background there first, but huge thanks to the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies, WUCA, the Water Research Foundation, Denver Water, and San Francisco Water Utility Commission, Public Utility Commission, SFPUC, for their support and continued engagement in this effort. All right, so as Kavita mentioned, WUCA regularly updates its strategic planning process. And so the project that started in 2018 that was really focusing on how to map climate-related risks to water utility business practices or business functions. So this was, the original project was under the 2017 to 2021 strategic plan. And really the goal was to help to enhance climate literacy among member utilities, but also across business functions within the water utilities. It was intended to identify what was the exact climate data that was necessary to make decisions for water utilities beyond just the traditional engineering branches or environmental planning or water management. How do the finance folks need to make decisions on climate change into the future, and what data do they really need to make those decisions? And then started getting into this mainstreaming concept. The new plan really looks at more on the adaptation side. So it goes from understanding the climate aspects to really diving into adaptation and how that kind of supplements and complements climate mitigation, the greenhouse gas emission reduction concepts, and also how can it really get more into how water utilities are making decisions, incorporating climate considerations into all the decisions that they make. So a little bit of background on the strategic plan and some of the drivers for this specific project. So as I mentioned, there was a first study that started in 2018, was published in 2020. That was the original framework that we developed with 7 water utilities across the United States. And that led to wanting to test that framework through a tabletop exercise approach. Tabletop exercises are generally used through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and we were able to apply it to climate change to understand both the acute shocks to the water utility systems, as well as the chronic systemic stresses that, that the water utilities face. So that's how we then updated this framework by testing it through a tabletop exercise approach with Denver Water and SFPUC. You can find all of these frameworks and guidebooks online on the WUCA website, but also on the Water Resource Foundation website as well. So as I mentioned, the intent was to test this framework. So we tested it, pilot tested it with Denver Water and SFPUC to kind of identify where there might be gaps, where there were opportunities to really dig a little bit deeper with the business functions to truly understand what was most critical for them to understand in terms of climate data and climate science to make decisions more effectively and for the longer term. So we then were able to enhance the framework and begin the discussion of what does mainstreaming mean for these water utilities? What does it look like? How do you do that? What are the challenges and opportunities there? So down here on the bottom are some of our key objectives and really the tasks that we took to complete this framework and update the framework. So we researched existing and other existing frameworks, as well as pilot testing it through tabletop exercises, and then at the end develop some general communication and outreach materials for the water utility business function leads. All right, so generally, our tabletop exercises are done in person, but because of COVID, safety reasons, as well as wanting to make sure that we were not enhancing emissions by traveling to all these places, but we had a virtual tabletop exercise. And so this is what it looked like, and it was actually really effective because Zoom allowed us to have opportunities for everyone to speak up if they wanted to unmute themselves. They could also chat in the chat box. So it was, Zoom fatigue is a real thing, but for us, it really worked well. It was a 3-day effort, and everyone was incredibly engaged throughout. And these are just a couple of the different Denver Water business function leads who engaged in our tabletop exercise. So the framework itself, if you look at it online, it may look a little overwhelming, but it's actually a little bit simpler than it may look to run through. And the whole concept is that if you have the resources to run a tabletop exercise, great. If you don't, you can hold a workshop and it can still be just as effective, but may not get into the gritty details that you can get out of from a tabletop exercise. But we wanted to make sure that the water utilities or organizations that use this framework could afford to do this. So the basic steps are kind of what's the basic essentials that you need to do in order to understand and assess your climate-related risks and opportunities to your water utility business functions or organizational business functions, and then a more advanced steps that were really focused around the tabletop exercise. So before you actually conduct the exercise or have a workshop, try to go through steps 1, 2, and 3. And those are to define the assessment objectives and initiate planning. So get in leadership buy-in from the start and identify what your core objectives are that you're testing so that when you have the exercise completed, you've achieved those objectives as best you can. Then determine the focus for your assessment and then start to design and prepare for your exercise. After you have that foundation in place, and during the exercise, you're able to then map those potential impacts collaboratively with the business function leads at the table. You're able to identify and prioritize risks relative to mission critical business functions, and then also identify opportunities and solutions. One thing I want to note is that this framework is really mostly focused on identifying climate related risks, but not yet getting into the adaptation space. So we wanted to kind of start with the risks. What are the risks? How are we assessing the risks? How do we know that these are risks? And then start to think about the opportunities and solutions to prepare for and respond to those risks. So this is the actual framework. I'm not going to go into it in much detail, but I do want to highlight the fact that getting leadership buy-in from the start is critical. Having a champion who can lead this through start to finish and then beyond is going to be like hands down the success of this process. And so if you're able to do that from the start, that's excellent. And the highest level you can get buy-in, the better. So the other thing I want to highlight here is that we developed these Climate 101 trainings because business function leads within water utilities don't have to be climate scientists. They don't have to be climate experts. They shouldn't be, but they should be informed of what they need to know in terms of a changing climate. And that then allows them to connect the dots between what they know, what they are an expert in and what they know, so that they can actually then take it further and operationalize it, own it, and really be able to integrate and mainstream those climate considerations into their decision making. So the Climate 101 training was great to have before the exercise because it also allowed people a safe place to ask questions that they might think were silly, but are not silly. And they can get that out and better understand and be prepared to get into the tabletop exercise. So this is an example of a map. It's a little bit blurry, but you can see also these in the online publications, but this is how we would map based on a business function. So for instance, we started with health and safety. We then looked at what are the underlying conditions of the water utility without climate change. So what's the water utility facing today? So of course it was in a global pandemic. We have an aging workforce. There's political instability. employee health is at risk because of COVID and other kind of overworked capacity. So with those underlying conditions, we were then able to map what are the climate stressors that could exacerbate those. And then those were then identified into risks. We mapped the opportunities, but this was kind of the process that we took, and it was really helpful to do this collectively. And there were so many aha moments for people that were able to say, oh, employee stress and workplace fatigue could actually be worse if there's a heat wave or folks are outdoor workers and they have to, work within these really awful weather conditions. And how do we prepare them for doing that? How do we protect them and keep them safe in the face of extreme heat or extreme cold? So through this process, we were able to identify and co-develop.
You have about 1 minute left, Emily.
Thanks, Beth. Over 70 opportunities and solutions for Denver Water, about 40 for SFPUC. With this, we were able to identify some new climate research that might be needed. We were able to expand the tabletop exercise approach. Actually, Denver Water is now using this approach for other areas and business functions within their utility, and really started that conversation about how to mainstream climate considerations to make sure that water utilities were future ready. One last point is that, as I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of investors and regulators are really honing in on climate-related financial disclosure. So getting the financial piece and the costs associated with the risks, the climate risks, as well as the opportunities is kind of TBD, but more to come. So hold tight on that. But this is definitely a space that a lot of water utilities are exploring and wanting to dig in further. So I will stop there and turn it back to Beth.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate hearing that story of where this work had come together for you in that relationship with WUCA and the strategic plan. I'm happy now to welcome Julie back, and she's going to bring us in to an introduction of the framework, which WUCA has been leading and using to guide its practice. So Julie, to you.
Great. Well, thank you. So I'm excited to be sharing some more about the WUCA's leading practices. So this is a project that has been really inspired by over a decade of WUCA members working together. The work is envisioned and led by Laurna at Denver Water. And importantly, every WUCA agency also participated. Those listed on the slides have been really instrumental, plus others were brought into the conversation throughout the project. Also in our audience, we have some other WUCAs that were included, Mohammed Mahmoud and Keely Brooks, and you guys should feel free to chime into the chat if you have things to add as I go about presenting. So next slide. So here is a map of the 12 water utilities that are located along with the mission and vision that Kavita mentioned earlier. So folks are spread across the US, and many are in locations near mountains and reliant on snowpack. There are WUCAs that are really close to the sea, and so sea level rise is a real impact among so many other climate change concerns. So this leading practices is based on a very diverse geography and covers a lot of examples from a range of different climate change impacts that are being felt across the US and elsewhere around the world. So next slide. This work really aims to learn how to adapt to a changing climate and doing it together. So learning from each other is kind of the utmost importance in this work. Next slide. So the Leading Practices Project, the term leading is intentional. We didn't want to say best practices, as we recognize these practices are emerging and evolving as our understanding in climate science and adaptation evolve. And so our goal was really to gather and share WUCA's experiences to help develop and implement climate change adaptation more effectively. And the examples are largely focused on water utilities, but the concepts can be applied to adaptation more broadly in any sector. And so our path forward was to develop this set of versatile leading practices that are really grounded in experiences that spur innovation within and across utilities and with the adaptation community more broadly. And so delighted to be sharing this with all of you. Next slide. So through a series of conversations, we discussed what climate adaptation requires and quickly realized it's so much more than just understanding climate impacts or planning for them. Those are certainly critical, but there's more to it than that. So it includes engaging, so motivating action and supporting others, creating effective climate messages. It includes sustaining, so finding ways to monitor conditions, develop funding, maintain capacity, and manage expectations. And importantly, it's about acting, so implementing the changes in one's assets and actions. So these 5 different climate adaptation action areas we found to be really a useful organizing framework. And in the deeper dive, we'll discuss these in a bit more detail. Next slide. So of note, hopefully the wheel is spinning for you, but that's to remind me to tell you that the action areas aren't meant to be in any particular order, but we really encourage people to focus on what resonates most with them according to where they are at in their process, and then use this wheel to think about the opportunities for where they want to go. So next slide. So here's a longer list of the 39 current leading practices, which I won't go into detail in, but you can find online. So each of the practices is supported by examples from at least one utility, but most are actually supported by several. And of note, some of the practices fall under multiple action areas. So for example, the make the business case for climate adaptation fits under both the engage and the sustain action area. So next slide. So really quickly, just a breakdown of what makes up a leading practice. So at the top is kind of the leading practice headline. And then the circle indicates the action area. So in this case, this leading practice is under the understand action area. And the headline is really foster sustained relationships with the climate science community. And then there's like a 1 to 3 sentence description of the leading practice that's common across utilities. And you can advance the slide 1. And then there are examples. And usually there's at least, and the examples usually come from individual utilities, but and they include kind of a 1 to 2 paragraph explanation along with links to additional information. And so the idea here was really to make this easy to read and get the idea quickly. And then if you want to go into more detail, you can dig more deeply. And in addition to the examples from the utilities, in some of the leading practices, there are also additional resources. So those relate to a lot of the other efforts underway. So similar efforts or educational materials or more that can help people to make this leading practice come to fruition for them. So next slide. So a really quick illustration of what this looks like. So the leading practice here is engage, and it's seek out and support climate champions throughout your organization. And then several sentences of explanation. So the idea is progress happens more quickly with support by motivated individuals who value and prioritize climate adaptation work. And it's important to build these relationships and educate champions. So there are several examples that WUCA has really, and Emily even mentioned it earlier, the importance of champions is key. And so here, the example that's highlighted is from Austin Water, and they really wanted to make space for climate champions. And so they actually hired somebody in a new staff position to work on focusing on information sharing and cross-functional utility planning efforts. So if you advance the slide, so if you're interested in doing something like this, you could go on the website and link to their job description that they used. And so hopefully it provides you a starting point if this is something that you're interested in that you could build off, modify, and make your own. So next slide. So There's a report that highlights many of the practices and the context that I've just shared today, but actually most of the practices reside on the website. If the report would be 80 plus pages if we had them all, but we decided to do it on a website so they're easy to navigate, but also that this is information that can be shared through time, and as needed, more information can come in, and also information can be removed if things become dated. The hope is that these will be living, learning, leading practices. And this one in particular is a sneak peek at what Kavita will be sharing with you a bit more on the deeper dive. So next slide. So also online, you'll find a simple worksheet. This has been used by some WUCA utilities already as a brainstorming exercise to help them during their meetings to map out which practices they're currently working on and where they might want to go next. It's also, I think, an opportunity to promote more collaborative thinking, so you can have everybody fill in these blanks and come together to talk about it, whether it's within a utility or across utilities or across a region. And I think that's one of the things WUCA is really thinking about in how to integrate some of this thinking into their resilience training moving forward as well. So one final insight into these practices and their creation. So fairly early on in developing these, we were at the National Adaptation Forum in Madison, Wisconsin, which was when we could get together and be there in person. But we were able to pull together a review team. Emily was a part of that, as well as others in smaller utilities and those who have been really instrumental in moving climate adaptation forward. This review team really stressed the value of making these practices accessible to smaller utilities and those who might not have the same time and resources. And so to do that by sharing kind of the journey of how you got to where you got, and that success maybe didn't happen right away. And so that was advice WUCA members took really seriously in thinking through how to make these practices more accessible and useful to the broader community. And with that, I will close, and you'll both get to hear a little bit more about this later on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julie. I really appreciate hearing that framework. A lot of it really resonates with me at ASAP. We talk about our living guide on the principles of climate adaptation practice, also kind of a nod towards the learning that we're all doing, and definitely appreciate and look forward to a conversation about where we are with mainstreaming and how critical that kind of core function of like how we build adaptive capacity as something that we center in the work here at ASAP, and I know is centered in the work at WUCA and represented in this framework. So I'm thrilled to introduce now our next speaker, Kari Davis. Kari is a young water and climate professional. She's the technical director at the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, or AGWA, where she works to build water resilience across a variety of sectors and contexts. Her recent projects relate to mainstreaming nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation, advancing and developing tools for decision-making under uncertainty, and analyzing food, water, climate trade-offs. An engineer by training, she's interested in how we use technical approaches to better support and advance equity and justice worldwide. Kari, thank you so much for making time for this, especially as I know AGWA is deep into COP, and I know that you have been running panels globally. So thanks for joining us here. Looking forward to learning more.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. And very happy to be here. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. Today, I'm going to talk about something totally new, the Water Resilience Assessment Framework, or WRAF. My colleagues and I at the CEO Water Mandate, Pacific Institute, WRI, and EME began this work in 2019, and the core document was launched earlier this year at Stockholm World Water Week in August. The WRAF is a new framework, and I encourage you to download it and think about how you and your organization can engage with the WRAF. Next slide, please. Thanks. So first, why are we talking about water resilience? And why did we decide we need a framework to assess water resilience? As you are all aware, our world is changing. Climate change and other forces impact our water resources in known and unknown ways. These changes can be gradual or sudden, sometimes they're reversible, and often irreversible. A business as usual approach could fail to respond to future uncertainties. And we need to think about new ways to respond in order to keep our infrastructure and services running throughout shocks and stresses. The aim of the Water Resilience Assessment Framework is to help organizations, such as utilities, Build resilience. Overall, we are trying to stop shocks and stresses from becoming crises and to allow organizations to survive and thrive despite shifting conditions. Next slide. So the RAF shown here is a high-level framework that can be applied to any specific stakeholder or sectoral perspective. It is not designed to replace your existing water management practices and approaches, but it's to supplement them, to add a water resilience layer to what you're already doing. For example, some of Emily's colleagues at WSP and I are currently exploring the links between the RAF and the WUCA framework, so be on the lookout for that later this year. The RAF is composed of 4 steps. It describes a set of logical processes to first assess this component and boundaries, select and develop resilient strategies and their implementable resilient actions, and then test the impact of those actions to enhance resilience of the system. The framework also provides a means to evaluate, and if needed, revise choices taken during the previous steps. The RAF is an iterative process and is meant to be used multiple times in a rinse and repeat approach. Stakeholder engagement is also important to include in all steps of the RAF. However, it can be tailored based on organizational and system needs, as well as their capacity. However, special efforts should be made to engage with stakeholders who have the most impact on the water system, as well as those that are most impacted by the water system itself. I'm going to spend the rest of the time today walking through some important aspects of the framework. However, I will note, much like the WUCA framework, there's a lot more into it, and I would encourage you to download the publication and take a look yourself. So the first step in the RAF, like many frameworks, involves defining their system. In this case, the system boundary may be larger than your organization or river basin. A system here is not just your basin or supply chain, but a set of interconnected socioeconomic, institutional, governance, infrastructure, management, and biophysical components that function as a whole. These components can also change over time, and as such, your system can change over time. An example here is looking at Mexico City's water supply network. Mexico City simultaneously has issues of water scarcity and urban flooding. And water is supplied through a combination of surface water and groundwater, which is different than it initially was, where water supplies from the lake on which it was built. Surface water here is transferred from outside the boundaries, which is much larger than the city itself. In the figure here, Mexico City is in pink, and the areas where water is transferred from are in green and gray. So therefore, the system is much larger than the city itself. In this case, the boundary would be this whole area, not just Mexico City. The first step of the RAF also includes identifying types of changes we are facing and foreseeing. Next slide, please. Great, thanks. So we need to first think about what we're facing and how those changes affect critical system processes. And the scale, direction, and longevity of these changes, in particular, is how they tell us how they affect our system. And they can be gradual, continual, or abrupt. In the RAF, we group changes into 3 categories. So first, we have short-term disruption. So here, there's no major shift in the mean conditions. These are temporary changes that overall do not affect the system. For example, here, we can look at the winter storms that Texas experienced in February. These storms, which were much colder than normal Texas winters, stressed out utilities to the point of failure, but ultimately they were able to bounce back to pre-storm conditions. The next type here is gradual short-term disruptions. These are slow, predictable changes, such as climate impacts to water resources. We know that flow patterns are changing, and we can predict these, react, and plan for these changes, such as decreased flows that increase demand in the Colorado River Basin. The third type is the most unpredictable. These sudden long-term disruptions are a quick change that really transform the system from what it was before to a new state. The system here is no longer as it was. An example of these here could be the widespread forest fires in the West this past summer. So based on what type of shocks and stresses we interpret here, we then can think about how to respond to them by choosing a resilient strategy. A resilient strategy is a systematic approach to understanding and addressing driver shocks and stresses impacting your system, and they directly relate to the type of disruption you assess in the first step. In the RAF, we included 3 types of resilient strategies, which directly correspond to these disruptions. The first, persistence, is the business as usual scenario. The functions and processes of the system continue unchanged with only a brief interruption, and after a disturbance, you quickly return to the pre-shock conditions. The second, adaptation, assumes that tomorrow will be different than today. Most of these changes are gradual and predictable, and we can track these changes and address them as they come up. Transformation is a sudden fundamental shift in the system or the needs of the system. Transformation is severely different than what you're already doing. A transformation strategy really truthfully requires considering what you're doing and how you can change those things to respond to a new system state. Different strategies might be appropriate for different components of the system, and like system boundaries may change over time. In order to operationalize the strategy, you have to think beyond just selecting the strategy and what actions you take to implement it. Additional planning is required here. In order to select actions, you first need to look at your strategy and decide what characteristics are important to include. Characteristics can vary, but some important ones are robustness, flexibility, and equity. A persistent strategy might require more robust characteristics, while an adaptation strategy might require more flexible elements. Based on the characteristics you discuss, then you can select actions to support those characteristics, and then indicators which can be used to further stress test the actions. While I'm not going to spend a ton on time with this today, stress testing and evaluation are very important components of the RAF. Stress testing here helps to determine the relative impact and utility of resilience actions under a range of plausible future scenarios. It really clarifies how the actions respond to stresses and shocks and how effective they are to building resilience. A stress test can also be used to compare actions and decide which one is the best for your system. As the RAF is an iterative process, it's very important to continually evaluate your results and refine them. The stress test here will also dictate what part of the RAF you return to when revising your strategy. After implementing the actions, which it goes beyond the RAF itself, additional monitoring and evaluation is required in order to assess how the system is responding to your actions, as well as any additional system changes. I would encourage then a user of the RAF to then return to the RAF periodically to determine if additional action is needed. As the RAF is a new framework, we are currently developing ways to support its implementation. First off, we're developing sector-specific guidance documents, including for utilities, to really support this and provide more detailed information for sector-specific concerns, such as indicators. We are also looking and exploring piloting and partnership opportunities. And I'd really encourage you to reach out if you'd like to be involved in the sector-specific guidance documents or partnerships for piloting. If you'd like to learn more, as Beth mentioned, AGWA is involved in many different events in the COP, including one for their water resilience assessment framework, which will be on Monday, this following Monday in the Water Pavilion. And I can put more information in there in the chat. So I'll leave it at that for now. And I want to thank everyone. And I'm looking forward to discussing this more later in the session. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kari. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate the kind of framework that I hope we'll get to come back to in the discussion of having persistence, adaptation, and transformation. And as we really grapple with and come to recognize that some of our systems are moving towards something completely different. And how do we make that assessment of what is it that we are participating in and what's our role, I think, in facilitating the transition that we're living through and part of. I'm happy now to invite back Kavita and Julie in support of her. And we're going to hear some going back to the WUCA guide and what has it looked like for these kinds of leading adaptation strategies to be implemented in practice and dive into those case studies, get our hands a little dirty. And I know that some folks are using the Q&A. I hope that others can see those responses. Please feel free, put your questions in there. And of course, our presenters have been quick to respond, and whatever doesn't get responded to in the Q&A by text, we'll bring into our conversation, which will follow this next presentation. So Kavita, to you and Julie.
Great. So we're returning a bit more to do a deeper dive on the leading practices. And next slide, just to orientate you, here are the 5 different climate action areas I shared earlier, which include engage, understand, plan, implement, and sustain. And Kavita and I are going to do a bit of a tag team presentation and share with you all a bit more about each of these action areas and highlight 1 or 2 practices from each. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Kavita to talk about engage.
Thanks, Julie. Okay, let's just dive in. So the first example we're going to highlight is from the Engage Adaptation Action area. And that, as a reminder, that's motivating action, engaging stakeholders, supporting others, and developing climate messages. Next slide. So the leading practice that we want to highlight for you all today is to include equity from the beginning. And this is because the leading practice is engaging and focusing on the needs of communities, particularly those most vulnerable to disruptions caused by climate impacts, is best done at the beginning and throughout a project and adaptation effort for the benefit of everyone. So the example we want to provide today is from my agency, the Portland Water Bureau. So there's a few things we've done related to climate and equity because those 2 issues are very interlinked in the work we do. We embedded equity in every part of our recent 5-year strategic plan, and that included climate change action. So if you're going through a strategic planning effort, that's a really good way to connect climate and equity. This really helped us redefine our organizational commitment to equity. We have a plan at the Portland Water Bureau to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion, and there's many components to it, but it also includes climate actions to mitigate extreme events like wildfire smoke and extreme heat waves and their impacts on our outdoor workers who are most vulnerable and exposed to these types of climate events because of the nature of their work. In particular, we know our Black, Indigenous, and people of color employees may be more vulnerable due to historical health, economic, and social disparities. Next slide. We also have an equity manager and a team who working on equity who collaborate with our climate change team and our staff in our organization. Another way to bring those 2 components of this larger picture together. And our agency has a goal to reduce carbon emissions 50% by 2030. This is actually not just important in and of itself to reduce carbon emissions, but it's actually a really important racial equity strategy because we, again, know that Black, Indigenous, people of color, and vulnerable populations are most harmed by climate change. So taking action to reduce further impacts of climate change now can actually have equitable outcomes in the long run. We also consider affordability and rate impacts to our low-income customers from large infrastructure investments. So when we invest in infrastructure, the large capital costs are often translated to our customers through increases to their utility bills. So we acknowledge that a lot of our customer groups like low-income customers can't actually tolerate increases in their utility bills. So we need to really be thoughtful about what we're investing in and how we increase our cost to factor in equity. Next slide. Julie.
So now I'll jump in. The next action area we'll talk about is understand. So these action area, this focuses on understanding climate science, understanding your system, understanding your system's vulnerabilities, risks, and opportunities. So next slide. As an example of a leading practice in this action area is to foster sustained relationships with the climate science community. So the idea here is that climate science continues to advance and provides new data, tools, and knowledge. And long-term relationships can really help in navigating what is new and what is relevant and what are climate questions that are important. So this really gets at the type of partnership that has been really valuable in this space for WUCA and something they've valued over the past decade. So the one example that is being shared here is from Tampa Bay Water. So for almost a decade, Tampa Bay Water has supported students to work for the utility. The program allows for a continuous connection with the university community. It supports the growth of a workforce that's savvy both in utility needs and applied climate change science, and really can help to transfer knowledge from research to applications, as well as build tools that are operated in-house. So next slide. The next action area that we'll share is plan. So this is focused on planning for multiple futures and building capacity. To illustrate this area, we have two leading practices that we'll share. So next slide. The first is focusing on leveraging the power of well-placed climate change screening questions. And so the idea here is that climate adaptation happens when there's increased awareness that the future conditions will be different than the past. And while it's often not clear how big changes are going to be, a lot can be learned from just asking people to evaluate new vulnerabilities and consider the implications of an uncertain future. And so for this example, it comes from San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, and they developed a sea level rise checklist in which they incorporated it into their capital planning process. And it's really designed to make people stop and consider what sea level rise implications might be, which has really spurred innovations. So if you advance the slide, one such innovation is that they decided to design their fireboat pier so it can rise with rising seas. So next slide. Another example of leading practices is in the plan category is to take on climate change as another component of risk management. So the idea here is that while climate change adds new elements, utilities already have many tools for managing uncertainty and risk that can be leveraged. So the example here is Southern Nevada Water Authority conducted an enterprise-wide risk assessment where they looked closely at all of their business function areas and asked, what is your existing risk and how might that change with climate change? And so things like increasing frequency of failure. So this work clearly aligns with the work Emily talked about with business function mapping. And if you were to go online, you would find links from this leading practice to what Emily shared earlier as well. So next slide.
Okay, great. Thanks. So now on to the implement adaptation action area, which is implement is acting to implement changes in assets and actions. Next slide. So the leading practice here that we want to highlight today is to enact changes in your facility plans, designs, and operations. So the Water Utility Climate Alliance recognizes we don't want to just change how we plan our water supplies, but how we actually design and build our infrastructure and assets to be more resilient to tolerate climate shocks. So we developed a suite of what we call engineering case studies to support peer-to-peer learning amongst engineers in the water sector to show engineers how to integrate climate change information into infrastructure projects and plans and designs. Next slide. So we don't have a time to go into all these examples today, but this is a whole nother project that WUCA is providing to the community, and it's called Engineering Case Studies. So you can visit it on our website. We developed 8 case studies, and these are 2-page briefs that highlight how 8 different water sector organizations, including one international example, developed climate-ready designs for their infrastructure or their projects. And we also highlight lessons learned and contact information for who you can speak to for more information, especially if you're an engineer and want to get into the nitty-gritty of how to design differently. This is a great resource for you. Next slide. Go ahead.
All right. So our final action area is sustain. So sustaining action, really focusing on the importance of monitoring conditions, developing funding, maintaining capacity, and managing people's expectations as to what climate science and adaptation involve. So next slide. The leading practice we chose to highlight in this area was to establish a community of practice to integrate climate change. So the idea is a community can really provide a supportive forum for instigating ideas, defining focus, sharing knowledge, and communally advancing and celebrating progress. And so a community of practice can be helpful at multiple levels across an organization or an alliance such as WUCA, or what ASAP is doing as well. But or it could be applied just to a specific utility or within a region. So the example we're sharing here is from Seattle Public Utility, and they decided that within their utility, for greater clarity and cohesion in their climate work, they would establish a community that would meet quarterly to share broadly about climate-related information, impacts, initiatives, concerns, and innovations. And I think this really highlights how much value there is when communities come together to share lessons and leading practices, and is, I think, one of the reasons we're so delighted to be here sharing this with you all today. So now I'm going to pass it back to Kavita for some valuable lessons that were learned through the process.
Yeah, so just to wrap it all up, these are just some of the examples we've developed. There are so many more, so please do visit our website to learn about these. But from this whole process, we learned some really valuable adaptation lessons. One of the first was that champions are integral. Climate champions are so important for catalyzing the work in our organizations and then sustaining that work and making it successful in the long run. So you guys are all doing really, really great, important work. We are all struggling with mainstreaming, but it is still important. So embedding climate change into how we make decisions and think differently in our organizations is so critical, and it can be really transformative for our organizations. We learned that adaptation is iterative. It's not a perfect science. So as Julie alluded to, or actually specifically called out, these are leading practices. They're not best practices because climate change is continually evolving and our understanding of how we respond is emerging. And so we may need to refine these practices or change course as we learn more, and that's okay, but we want to get started. Also, the science will never be perfect. So this is something that we've seen a lot of people get stuck in, is this trap of analysis paralysis, waiting for the perfect science, the next best climate modeling experiment, the next climate report. But we can often use that as a reason to not move forward. And we don't want to do that. We want to get going now. We have enough information about how these changes are manifesting from extreme events now. And so we should move forward and recognize that we can refine our adaptation actions in response down the road. And then finally, the process is often more important than the resulting plan. Just having these conversations about climate change in our organizations was really transformative in and of itself and led to new ways of thinking and processing that actually went beyond just the climate work in our organizations to how we do our long-term planning, how we invest in our communities and so forth. And so just going through the process itself can be very change-making. So with that, next slide, I think we just want to thank you for your time and answer any questions. Laurna Kaatz from Denver Water spearheaded this project. We want to thank her. She was not able to be here today, but she was the champion, so to speak, of this project. And Julie Vano, without your research collaboration, this project wouldn't have been as successful or sophisticated as it is. So thank you. Also, my contact information is on there. And again, please visit us at wucaonline.org to find out some more about these examples. Thank you.
That was a terrific, I guess, spin around the wheel, if you will, of the leading practices and adaptation. Thank you so much for those. I know that there's a lot more that I'm sure participants here are going to want to be digging into. And again, I've seen some questions coming in the Q&A, and whatever doesn't get answered there, we'll bring into the panel conversation, which is where we are now. So I invite Kari and Emily to bring your cameras back on. And as folks are listening in, we're going to start with some questions here. I certainly have some questions for this group of experts, and I'm sure that you do as well. So just to dive right in, I mean, first, again, let me say thank you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for taking the time to be here in this conversation. And I think sharing what has made work successful. And I'm going to ask you now to talk some about what has been maybe a challenge that you've encountered. I've heard all of you talk about mainstreaming and the importance of mainstreaming. But what is it that what are the challenges that you faced in mainstreaming and integrating climate adaptation into your work? And then, of course, I'm going to want to know what are the secret solutions, that are out there. But just first, why has this been a challenge in your organizations?
Well, I can get started. I'll kick us off. So one of the things we often see, at least in our sector, in the water sector, is just this assumption climate change is a long-term phenomenon. And I think we all know from recent years that we're seeing this phenomenon manifest now in extreme events, right? Wildfires, heat waves, floods, hurricanes, et cetera. And so really pointing that out to people to connect why we need to actually take action now. The other thing that I think, so that's a challenge, is just recognizing that this is a phenomenon that we're already experiencing and dealing with now. I might come back to a solution in a moment. I'll let someone else share if they have other thoughts.
Anybody else, Kari or Emily, have thoughts on about why is mainstreaming a challenge?
Yeah, I mean, it's so many thoughts. You know, it's really, it hits on a variety of different things that were already mentioned, but you know, truly to make this transformative change that Kari mentioned, that is truly needed, you know, we need all hands on deck. And we can't go from what is climate change to let's mainstream it. There's a, you know, there's a comfort level with people of, okay, what does it mean for me? How does it affect me? And then they tell us, you know, how does it affect the decisions that you're making, and what do you need in order to make a decision? And so we have to, you know, we have to manage so many expectations. Honestly, it's that, and it's also what Kavita mentioned in terms of the science is never going to be perfect, but we have to start, and we have to do what we can with what we have, and know that it's going to be adaptive, and we have to be flexible as we go on this journey, and just to learn from things that either are not working well or are working well. And the last thing that I'll mention is that you know, centering equity from the start is so essential, because something that we heard through SFPUC was, you know, the lack of affordable housing in San Francisco and the Bay Area really doesn't allow for them to be able to attract and retain really good people within their organization that can stay there and afford to live there long term. So that connection between affordable housing with pay equity and the skills that are truly needed to effectively operate a water utility in the changing climate is a lot. And so enabled, and we're in this region, I live and work in Oakland, California, and you know, the tech industry is booming. And so how do water utilities enable their staff to sort of thrive in the water utility space, not having to commute hours on end to get to and from? And also, how can they make sure that the ratepayers can afford to pay increased rates if that ends up happening, to afford climate action?
Yeah, I hear that, the challenge of these converging crises and resource constraints that can't be put into a different category away from the adaptation work. Kari, I know you were trying to come in there too, so please.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's a lot of challenges, and we're all quite clear on what many of them are and run into them daily in our work and our lives. But I think maybe thinking about potential solutions here, it's really going back to the starting with the people that are most impacted by climate change or whatever other impacts we're looking at, and starting there with defining the problem at the lowest level. So having it very much ingrained into the first step of any decision-making process. So there's a whole family of approaches here, more widely known as bottom-up approaches, that really take this uncertainty piece and acknowledge the uncertainty, and then say, okay, we need to get moving and get planning. We can't wait anymore. We have to do things now.
Yeah, I've always been really moved by a quote of, if you believe that people are people, and if you treat people as people, then you will see that work has to begin at those who may have the most perceived need, but also have often the most wisdom that can bring to these processes. And then we begin, you know, and then then the work begins. Kavita, I know you had a solution on the tip of your tongue, so please, over to you.
Okay, one solution that works in, I think, many sectors, including the water sector, is to talk about the avoided costs by acting now. So really trying to quantify what those costs are going to be down the road. People like to think, well, if we act now and invest in climate change, that's a lot of money and we may not need to do that. Well, if we can demonstrate that there's actually higher cost to inaction and we're actually saving money now by investing sooner in climate resilience and adaptation, that can go a long way to communicating that to decision makers in our organizations and sectors. So that's something that WUCA has really tried to build out. We developed a project on extreme heat impacts and the costs of not acting on extreme heat, both from a human health perspective and also from an infrastructure perspective. That's another project you can find on our website. But really defining those costs as a community, I think, is really important, so we can communicate and really try and convince people that we need to act now. The other thing is very different. If we're many of us who work in large organizations, how do you integrate climate change into the work we do? Well, a very practical way is to include performance objectives for people that require them to think about climate change and equity. We do that in our organization. We have, at least right now, a mandatory equity performance objective that all employees of the city of Portland have to develop to get a pay rise. And we're starting to think about doing the same thing for climate change. So that's just another kind of example of how we can mainstream better these issues.
I really love both those really practical, really pragmatic approaches. I encourage people, reach out to Kavita for that avoided loss. And also I heard Susie Torrientes speak about this last week on a park project and how they were calculating out 3 different timelines of if you wait this long, if you wait this long, if you wait this long. So I know it's hard to do, but it's happening. And so feel free to reach out for connections.
And just on that, sorry, one of our leading practices that we didn't speak about is from New York City, and they actually quantified the cost to their wastewater system of not acting on climate change. It was like a savings of $2 billion. It was like a $2 billion price tag if they hadn't acted. So there are examples in this project too.
Yeah, and I think I would build on the fact that there's so much value in bringing people together to test out kind of the soft measures of adaptation of, do you have a business continuity plan, and does that address extreme heat? And how do you test that? Does it just sit on the shelf, or have you done a drill that you know how to prepare for and respond to extreme heat for your workers? So building climate considerations into already existing frameworks or measures or processes can be super effective. And also just the people aspect, going beyond an analysis makes such a difference, to use the analysis, but then play it out and really test it and see if it's effective and what holes might be there. So I think there are different ways that, you can start to think about mainstreaming soft and hard infrastructure as well.
So staying in the spirit that we've touched on a couple times, it is the first day of COP, and I think we have a great question here of what role does climate mitigation play in climate adaptation or on its own merits? But let's start with the role that climate mitigation plays in climate adaptation work.
Yeah, well, I think that, first of all, it's important in and of itself, as we all know, to reduce future impacts. But it's also a really important adaptation strategy, going back to that avoided cost point, is that by acting now, reducing our emissions, we're baking in less into the climate system to have to respond to and spend more money on down the road. So there's a direct link. But it's important in and of itself from a climate leadership perspective. If we want to show leadership on climate change, we can't just be acting to adapt. We need to be acting to reduce our impact on the climate system and mitigate. And from an equity perspective, as I pointed out in one of the leading practices, it's so important because we know so many Black, Indigenous, people of color communities are harmed by climate impacts. They're often on the front lines of these impacts. So there's so many reasons that mitigation really needs to be at the forefront of our work.
Yeah, I think, adding on that, I think one important differentiation to make is that adaptation doesn't mean that we've given up on mitigation. I think they are very much hand in hand, and you need both. And I think some solutions can achieve both, like nature-based solutions, for example, can provide both mitigation and adaptation benefits. And those are both important to include and quantify. I think mitigation is easier for people to understand because it is very clear and tractable. You can say carbon emissions, and that's something that's way clearer than sea level rise protection in X number of years. So I think just trying to think of a way to reframe that is important too. And if you are following COP, there's a lot of really good side events that are open to the public in various spaces that touch on all these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would add that when utilities or organizations are investing in renewable energy or investing in measures to reduce their carbon footprint, whether it be through maybe supply chain, and they can ask questions about, is this infrastructure going to be resilient in a future changing climate? Like making those investments now, getting to Kavita's point, if you're making those investments, you're going to want to know whether it's going to be able to withstand future impacts. So that piece of climate mitigation and adaptation is so critical. And truly in the supply chain aspect, there's more and more, as we can see just from this year, and COVID has brought a lot of rise in understanding supply chains and the impact of diverse suppliers and redundancies in suppliers on a system. And so I think really, if you're doing kind of a supply chain analysis or even value chain analysis for sustainability, think about resilience and think about questions that you could ask regarding how the suppliers are preparing for or managing climate risks. And if they can't afford to, how can you as an organization support them?
Awesome. Thank you. I love those points, and building from that point of things that we've learned from COVID-19. I'd say for myself, I've really taken away from it an inspiration watching the public health community just be very clear about treatment and prevention happen simultaneously. And I think about that in our work in the climate community, and all of us having an obligation to be really talking hand in hand about climate adaptation and mitigation, which is really the treatment and prevention, of this crisis that we find ourselves in. There's so much opportunity for us to do better and to do more on all fronts, of course. So let's talk some about transferring lessons beyond the water utilities. And I know some of this was about the water industry, but I'm going to go to WUCA first because we started with your journey, and I think that in some ways I look at this leading practices guide and it's almost a gift out to the adaptation community who knows WUCA is there doing great work, often kind of saying what's going on, and now we have this report. What inspired that, and what do you hope people will be inspired by when they see this report, and how do you see these lessons transferring out to the world?
Oh, great question. Well, thank you for giving us a platform to do that today. I mean, this is one of our strategies, is to engage with partners like you with ASAP and AGWA and WSP and Aspen Global Change Institute. So partnering with others in the community, because climate adaptation is a team sport. We need to work on this together. And then why it's important to WUCA is it's part of our vision. Our vision is that climate resilient water utilities that support thriving communities. And we can't get to that vision unless we broaden our lessons across beyond the water sector, right? And we have very specific objectives in our strategic plan to transfer knowledge to not just our water sector peers, but to others in the adaptation community. So from the start, it's been a really core part of why we do the work we do. Julie, do you want to talk about it from maybe the collaborator perspective?
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel like that the knowledge of those 5 different action areas are so, like, in my beginning remarks, like, it expanded my perspective of, so from somebody who is really thinking in the research space and so focused on getting those models up to date so that they can be shared with utilities, and kind of, it was humbling to be like, actually, it's more than that. I mean, that's an important part, but I think like getting to see that whole, and then to get really specific examples of people who are working on the ground and doing this sort of work, which I think of like the value that can have to the research community in asking the questions that are most relevant to moving the science forward, is also something that I have really benefited from this whole process.